they told us that natural gas is the bridge to the future.
Yep.
Well, it's not. It is the future.
Hi there, I'm Mike Larson, Editor-in-Chief with MoneyShow, and I'm coming to you from the MoneyShow Masters Symposium, Las Vegas. Today I'm sitting down with Alhajji, Managing Partner at Energy Outlook Advisors. Anas, how are you?
Very well, very well. It's been a busy, great day today here at the Money Show in Las Vegas.
We're so happy to have you. Certainly you had a lot of people that wanted to hear a little bit more about what's going on in the energy markets. People who weren't here at the presentation, maybe give them a few bullet points. What is happening in the Middle East? What do people need to know if they're invested in the sector?
Well, today we have two big stories, basically. el-Mandeb story, when the Houthis basically declared war on Saudi Arabia. And then we have the other story, the Ukrainians, or supposedly the Ukrainians basically attacking the CPC terminal in Russia that blocked the Kazakh oil or crude oil production. So that affected prices. Prices went up, and then by the end of the day, we lost all the gains. The big issue here is we have the Hormuz crisis, and now we don't know what's going to happen in el-Mandeb. Of course, we have scenarios for those who are interested to look at the impact of each. But the bottom line here for the retail investors in particular, that what you are going to gain from this crisis. It's unfortunate that we are talking about money out of a crisis, but that's what really money is made anyway. We are bullish on LNG.
Okay.
We are bullish on coal. And now sulfur is emerging as something big.
Okay.
Sulfur basically is needed for so many things, etc. And because sulfur shipments are blocked out of the Hormuz Strait, so companies that produce the sulfur, it's not necessarily that people will look for a company that produces sulfur. It is byproduct, but all of a sudden become the center of attention when the prices go through the roof.
Got it.
In this case. So there are areas where people can benefit from it. US LNG in particular is going to gain no matter what. Even if the Hormuz crisis is going to end, we are going to see a continuous growth in the US LNG industry. And our view about natural gas in general, that they told us that natural gas is the bridge to the future.
Yep.
Well, it's not. It is the future.
Yeah.
It is the future.
Yeah.
So natural gas, I'm not talking about natural gas in the United States, particularly because it has a special situation where it could be bullish everywhere else except in the United States.
Understood.
But LNG is big.
Okay. I want to talk about the big issue, the Strait of Hormuz, and a couple of the points that you made briefly. One of which we had a questioner ask about how easy it would be to bypass the strait by some of the countries in the region having new pipelines, new canals, and so on. And you said, well, I'm not paraphrase what you said. Why don't you tell the viewers of this?
Well, that theory is not correct. I mean, pipelines, etc. Or canals, that was a good idea 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, when people proposed the pipelines or a canal across Saudi Arabia or a canal around the UAE or pipelines through Yemen or Oman, etc., these were great ideas at that time. But for the last 15 years, technology advanced so much that just a couple of young men with little money buying drones basically can hold a project worth billions of dollars. So look at Ukraine, what Ukraine is doing to Russia right now. You asked me earlier, or the group that came in earlier, we're talking about the impact of that. So we've seen what drones can do, even in the depth of Russia. So this is not an option anymore with this technology. But it makes perfect sense if pipelines make economic and financial sense. So if you look at the United Arab Emirates, already have a pipeline that circumvent the Hormuz Strait. Now they want to build another one next to it to circumvent it. But this pipeline, regardless of security, it makes perfect financial sense, because instead of thousands of ships basically crossing the Hormuz Strait a year to load, they don't need the whole trip basically, which is a 2-day trip, will be saved.
Yeah.
So imagine a VLCC with the crew, with the fuel, with the insurance, with the day rate, etc. All of that will be saved. So it makes perfect sense. If they can get security over that, that's perfect. Okay. But the whole idea is, okay, we are going to build pipelines across Saudi Arabia, across Yemen, across Oman, across Syria, across Israel, etc. Just that does not make any any sense at all. There is an alternative that I did not talk about today,
Okay.
but I focused on it recently in my weekly column. Just very interesting situation. What is really the alternative to Hormuz in this case? If diplomacy fail
Okay.
and politics fail, which is of course the ultimate substitutes for all the crises, but if everything is failed, then OPEC Plus as a whole should coordinate to build large strategic inventories in the consuming countries far away from any waterway, not only Hormuz.
Okay.
So whether you talk about the Turkish waterways, you talk about the Norwegian waterways, you talk about the Malacca Strait or Panama Canal or anything, just far away from everyone. You build those massive storage coordinated by OPEC Plus, okay? And this will create a completely different market and completely different atmosphere, whether you talk about the economics, the finance, or the cooperation on managing the oil market. And all of a sudden, and this is one of the beauties of this idea, is you have countries that are classified as consumers. During crisis, they become exporters.
An interesting concept.
So the interests basically become aligned, more aligned, and the interests of consumers and producers become more aligned in this case. So those who are looking for alternatives to Hormuz or any other waterway, strategic storage basically becomes the choice. And it's extremely cheap relative to the cost of pipelines or canals.
Okay. Since you're talking about strategic inventories, obviously part of your presentation was about the SPR here in the US and some of the myths and things that people, misconceptions people have of that. Briefly, could you describe what those would be?
Yes. First of all, when we talk about the first mistake that many people did is when they show a massive decline in total inventories, whether the globe or the United States. That's a mistake because they are mixing apples and oranges. Strategic petroleum reserves are designed to lower prices. So a decline in commercial inventories raises prices. A decline in strategic petroleum reserves lower prices. So these are two different things. You cannot put them together. So that's the first fact. The second fact is, if you look at the United States right now, some people are raising the issue that the technical limit is about 250 million.
Okay.
Well, this is not really a technical limit. This is a legal limit. So the Congress set the bottom at 252, I believe, 252 million barrels. So that's the legal limit. But they give the president basically the discretion to use more if he deemed that this is an emergency. So we can go lower.
Got it.
What is the technical limit? No one knows. So we have guesses from some experts. Some of them said 160, others said 80. We don't know. But anyway, you look at the technical limit, it is way lower than the legal limit. So we still have more to release if needed. The other related issue, and I did not talk about it today, which is a very important point, that there was an incentive for the companies to withdraw more from the SPR. That incentive basically goes down every time prices go down. Not because of the abundance of oil. It is a kind of very simple math. The release from the SPR is not a sale.
Right.
It's a loan. I, as an oil company, I can borrow oil at $120 from the government. Let's say I borrow 10 million.
Okay.
And I'm supposed to return them 12 million later on. Okay. So I borrow when oil was at 120, but I'm going to return it when oil is at 70. So even paying an additional 2 million makes major profit to me in hundreds of millions of dollars at the expense of the taxpayer. So there was a big incentive for the companies to take an
Got it.
But as prices decline, I mean, why borrow at 70 to return it at 80?
Sure.
Or 75? Okay. So the incentive basically disappears. So it's not really the fact is that we need that oil, and therefore if we stop, it's a shortage. It's just a financial opportunity for the companies to do that.
Got it. I guess my last question would be, if somebody doesn't really know the ins and outs and the way the energy market works, they might see the fact that when the war happened, oil spiked, we're talking about triple-digit prices. Here we are, the ceasefire appears to have failed, and yet we're still talking about double-digit prices. Why is that? How do you think things unfold over the coming months?
There are, because in a sense, you cannot kill the horse twice. Okay, that's really the bottom line.
Okay.
The damage already happened from the first time, okay? And we are still living the impact of that damage. So if you hit the same thing twice, it's not going to make a difference to the market. At the same time, for example, if you look at OPEC, we already seen OPEC production increasing by 3 million barrels. We already seen massive amount of oil leaving the Hormuz Strait since the MOU, okay? So that's the case. But the reason why the price did not rise again is simply because you cannot kill the horse twice.
Well, Honest, thank you so much for
You're
taking
welcome.
time out here to speak. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.